Go ahead and start, and if people trickle in during the introduction, that will also be okay. So I'd like to welcome you all to the annual Borka Tomljenović lecture, Migration and Narration, which will be joined by Aleksandar Hemon, an author and professor of creative writing at Princeton University. Before I get to that, I just want to introduce myself. For those of you who I haven't met, my name's Elizabeth King. I'm the current director of the Center for Russian, East European, Eurasian Studies. And I want to also take this opportunity to let you know about two of our upcoming events, part of our CREES Noon lecture series. On Wednesday, November 20th, we'll be joined by Nutsa Batashvili, a professor of anthropology at Free University of Tbilisi, to give a lecture on political anxieties in the Caucasus, the Georgian national narrative between war and peace. And on December 4th, for our CREES Noon lecture, we will be entitled All Art is a Political Statement. We'll be joined by Ariana Lekic-Friedrich, is a Croatian multimedia artist, and we'll be in conversation with Rebecca Modric, who's a professor of art at the Stamp School of Art and Design here at U of M. So you can also sign in if you aren't already on our mailing list and look at some of our upcoming events there. But for today's event, which you all are here for, I want to start by thanking Dr. Katerina Tomljenović-Borer, who's a professor emerita of kinesiology at the University of Michigan, who gave a generous gift to CREES to establish the Borka Tomljenović Southeast European Peace, Cooperation, and Conflict Fund. This lecture series honors the extraordinary life of her mother, Borka Tomljenović, who was born and raised in Bosnia, lived in Croatia and Serbia before immigrating to the United States during this disintegration of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. There's three different books that are available on the table outside this room. If you haven't already helped yourself to a copy, you're also welcome to do that. So thank you very much, Katrina, for this generous gift. And this is the third annual Tomljenović lecture. That in this lecture, Aleksandar will discuss issues of migration, narration, displacement, multilinguality, macaronic language, epic form, music, collaborative creativity, and the end of empires. He'll also do some readings from his most recent critically acclaimed novel, The World and All That It Holds. And then after he presents, does a reading, some talk, we'll sit down for a little bit more of discussion, and then I'll open it up to questions from the audience. We have two microphones, one on each side of the room. You can line up to ask your questions. I'll remind you of this, but it would be nice if you would say just your name and affiliation before asking the question, and then, we all want to there might be a lot of questions, so let's be succinct in asking our questions so we have time to get everyone's in. And if you're unable to come to the microphone, you can also let either Gita or Gosha know, and they will assist you by bringing you the microphone, right? Okay, but preference is for those who are able to please use the microphones on each side. All right, so Aleksandar Hemon was born in Sarajevo and currently teaches creative writing at Princeton University. He is the author of the Lazarus Project, which was a finalist for the 2008 National Book Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award, along with several short story collections and novels, including The Question of Bruno, Nowhere Man, Love and Obstacles, The Making of Zombie Wars, The Book of My Lives, and My Parents, An Introduction, This Does Not Belong to You. His most recent novel, The World and All That It Holds, was published in 2023. He has received several awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Genius Grant from the MacArthur Foundation, as well as the Passos Prize. Hemon co-wrote the script for The Matrix Resurrections with David Mitchell and Lana Wachowski. He's currently working on How Did You Get Here? Tales of Displacement. And when he's not busy, yes, writing and screenwriting, he produces music and also DJs as Cielo Hemon. Please join me in welcoming Aleksandar to the stage.
Thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Tomljenović-Borer, for making this happen or helping this happen. Thank you all for coming. On the eve of the elections, could be the last reading you'll have here. Or anywhere, for that matter. Anyway, jokes aside, I will read from my book, which starts in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914. I bet many of you know what happened on that day. But I'll just read first. The Holy One kept creating worlds and destroying them, creating worlds and destroying them, and then, just before giving up, he finally came up with this one. And it could be much worse, the world and all that it holds, as I certainly know how to get my hands on some interesting stuff around here. Let's see. Lapis infernalis, laudanum, next to it lavender. Pinto took the laudanum off the shelf, knocking over the lavender tin, which miraculously did not break open when it hit the floor. He released a drop of laudanum onto a sugar lump, watched the brown stain bloom, then placed it in his mouth. While the sugar and bitterness dissolved on his tongue, he picked up the lavender, dipped his nose into the tin, and inhaled. Vast Mediterranean flower fields stretched inside him, the blue sea lapping at his soul, a turquoise sky and swallows floating above it all, the laudanum sailing on his blood all the way to his mind, and then beyond. To all the things created at twilight on the Shabbat eve, the Lord wisely added laudanum just to help make everything more beautiful and bearable. Now was Rafael Pinto much better prepared, for the Archduke Franz Ferdinand von Österreich-Este, heir apparent to the Habsburg Empire and Inspector General of the Imperial Armed Forces, and for the whole spectacle he was bringing to Sarajevo just to see how we live here. We live rather well, Your Highness, I must say, provided there's enough laudanum and lavender on hand. Thank you very much for your kind concern. And since this is an enterprise of providing remedy for the body as much as for the soul, we're sure to have plenty of whatever we might need. Long live the Emperor, the Lord be praised, and bless you too. After a drab, rainy week, the morning was sunny, and the light broke through the windows as never before, rearranging the checkered floor into unprecedented patterns. The sugar was now completely dissolved, but the bitterness lingered, tickling his tongue. God wrapped himself in white garments, and the radiance of his majesty illuminated the world. And right here on the floor of the Apotheke Pinto, we can now behold a little patch of one of those very garments. There might be a poem for me to write about the light shifting and altering the visible. God's garments, it could be called. But then, who would ever care about any of it? No one cares about light and what it does to the soul, not here in this city behind God's back. Ever since Vienna, Pinto had been writing poetry in German. He wrote in Bosnian too, but only about Sarajevo. He even tried to write in Spanish, but that always felt like his nono was writing it, everything always sounding like an ancient proverb. Bonita de miel, corancico de fiel, casati veras al nanio milodiras, and so on. Whereas light is everywhere and nowhere, it exists, but never by itself, always a garment, just as God is noble only in the imperfection of his creation. Even darkness is clothed in light. Light makes itself present by its own absence. We carry the darkness inside and return it to the light when we die. That could sound good in German. Im Inneren tragen wir das Licht, da wir, wann wir sterben, zurückgeben der Finsternis. Survive this sentence in German. I'll stop here. What happens on this day, you might know, is that the Archduke gets shot in Sarajevo, just outside of the Apotheke Pinto. And Pinto, my main character, witnesses that. And thus, it should also maybe be pertinent to mention, given the importance of tomorrow's day, that on the day of the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, much of the world was governed by four empires: the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the British Empire, plus the Germans with imperial ambitions. Within 5 years, 3 of those empires vanished without a trace, unless you count countries like Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia and Romania as the trace of those empires. And not only did the empires vanish, but the entire model of social order, societies like the Habsburgs have been in power since the 16th century, I believe, maybe 17th century. No one remembered a different social order. No one in those empires, obviously. There was a republic somewhere in the United States. Anyway, this is the beginning of the short 20th century and the beginning of Pinto's trajectory, because he is forced to join the Austro-Hungarian army, which is then sent to fight, the Bosnian unit is sent to fight in what is now Western Ukraine, which was the easternmost province of the empire known as Galicia, which is where my grandparents were born on my father's side. I'm telling you this because everything that Elizabeth mentioned as a theme of today's lecture is in this book, right? I'm a writer, and a fiction writer, a novelist. I process these ideas and themes and concerns by way of making up stories. So these are the stories that I made up, and then we can talk about concepts in a little bit. So Pinto goes to war. He's a sanitet. He's a, what is it called? He's a medical staff, right? He's a, or in Bosnian, he's a hečim. And he falls in love with another Bosnian, Osman, who's of Muslim background, in the trenches of Galicia. They get, in 1916, on the Eastern Front in Galicia, which was held by the Austro-Hungarian troops and the German troops. The front was broken in June of 1916 in the something that was called the Brusilov Offensive in 1916, where the Russian troops broke the front and crushed Austro-Hungarian and German troops. 1 million soldiers died in that operation. Those who didn't, but were captured, they ended up in prisoners of war camps, Russian prisoner of war camps in Central Asia, in Tashkent and around. And so my heroes, Pinto and Osman, end up there. And this is where my book, thinking about my book started many, many years ago. Because I read a memoir by a British spy, Frederick Bailey, Colonel Frederick Bailey, who had a memoir called A Mission to Tashkent, because in 1918, he was sent from the British Raj to see what the situation in Central Asia was. As you may know, there was something called the Great Game, the rivalry between the British and the Russian Empire. They were angling to get territories from the other empire. So the Brits wanted to put their foot on the Central Asian ground and add that to the British Empire. And the Russians, of course, wanted to see what they can do about Afghanistan or whatever else comes in handy. And of course, the Russians got there in 1979, but that's a different story. Anyway, Frederick Bailey is sent from British Raj over the mountains to go down to Tashkent to see what's up with the Russians in Central Asia, because the revolution started, obviously, in October of 1917, the Second Revolution, and the ripples of it have reached, as he's landing in Tashkent, reached Central Asia. By the time he gets there, the Bolsheviks have taken control of the region and area and released many of the prisoners of war from the Austro-Hungarian and German armies. There were soldiers who had no way to get back through the war in Eastern Europe, so many of them just lingered, making do, and many of them joined Bolsheviks, many of them out of their beliefs and some out of convenience. I started thinking about this story because in the Colonel Bailey's memoir, and there's a character based on Colonel Bailey in this book, his nickname was Mad Hatter Bailey. He mentions that when he talks about his coming to Tashkent, where as soon as he comes, the Bolsheviks start looking for him, and a series of adventures ensue. He dresses as an Albanian soldier, formerly Albanian, then Romanian, hides all over Tashkent, hides in someone's basement. Eventually, he runs into someone who works for Čeka, and it's a guy named Mandić, and he's from Sarajevo. And Mandić tells him, I know who you are, I know you're a British spy, I want to get out of here. So let's work together. And Mandić, the Czech is of course the Soviet secret police, Mandić employs Bailey to work for him in the Čeka, and their primary task is to look for Bailey. So Bailey's got a job where he has to look for himself. That's the metaphysics of it still kill me. And meanwhile, and then they start plotting a way to get out. And the way they get out is Mandić, in his Sarajevo wit, with his Sarajevo wit, spreads the story that Bailey is in Bukhara, which is 100 miles down the road from Tashkent. And Bukhara is at that time controlled by a potentate, an emir, who hates the Bolsheviks and rules with iron hand. And Mandich starts spreading the rumor that Bailey is in Bukhara and is egging on the emir to attack Tashkent. And then he volunteers himself and Bailey to go to Bukhara and kill Bailey. And so they get the papers, they leave Tashkent, and halfway there, the Bolsheviks figure out the ruse and go after them. They made it to Bukhara. They imprisoned first, a little tortured, as is the local custom, and then eventually they convinced Emir that they're good guys, and Bailey and Mandich go to Persia, unlike in my book, because there were British troops there at the time. Bailey becomes a spy, that he already was, becomes a bigger spy, and Mandich vanishes from history. So I was reading this memoir, and because I randomly read history books, and I was fascinated by this character of Mandich, whose sole ideology, with which I can entirely identify, is to get back home. Right? Bolsheviks, great game. You screw yourself. I'm going home. I like that, and so I started imagining a character or characters who then, from that situation, look for ways to go back home. But of course, I had to bring them there. And so I started in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914. And then they had to go to Galicia, and then have to end up as prisoners of war in Tashkent. So I will read a little section from Tashkent. This is after they were all released. The prisoners were released from prisoners of war camps. And the Bailey-like character is already there. They are hanging out with the family of a Russian Jewish doctor, Isaac Abramovich, who also is hiding the Bailey character in the book. But Osman and Pinto get along with Isaac Abramovich, and they talk. When you are young, everything is easy, Isaac Abramovich said. Svetlana Theodorovna, his wife, used to say that when you are young, you have no end. As far as you can see, everything is a field that is your life, but you cannot see the end of that field. You cannot see the end. Pinto rose before Isaac Abramovich as if done with worshiping him, because he fell in front of him accidentally. Isaac Abramovich sat down on a large rock that was usually used as a table and placed the tray on the ground. Osman took it upon himself to pour the vodka into the cups. And when Pinto straightened up his stool and sat down, they were facing one another, their knees nearly touching. But Pinto could not look Isaac Abramovich in the eye because he didn't want to find out if he had seen them kissing. Osman and Pinto are lovers by this time and lived together, so they were kissing just before Isaac Abramovich came in. Ever since he woke up in the hospital and Isaac Abramovich welcomed him back to the world, Pinto spoke in Bosnian to him, while the good doctor spoke back in Russian. From the beginning, they would pick the words from the other's language and inserted them in their sentences, and thus they exchanged and learned them. Pinto sometimes clandestinely imported Spanish, just as Isaac Abramovich smuggled in Yiddish words, while Osman added Arabic words he had learned in mosque. Over time, they developed their pidgin, and they understood one another. No need for any translation. Back in Kishinev, when I was younger, Isaac Abramovich said, and wagged his finger to announce the beginning of the story, I had a friend, a very good friend, Benya. I loved Benya very much. We grew up together, Benya and I. We went swimming together. We read the Torah together. We read all kinds of books to each other, novels and poetry and whatnot. We loved Tolstoy because his people blush all the time. Benya was pale like an angel with a permanent blush on his cheek and thick, straight eyebrows. I liked to touch his eyebrows. They were like two little brushes. He would put his head in my lap, and I would stroke his forehead and read to him. People say that a man can only love God and a woman. But I loved him more than God, far more than any woman, and I never wanted to love anyone else. My father wanted me to get married, but I kept avoiding it. I wanted to be with Benya. Isaac Abramovich sat with his back to the house so that his face was in the dark, but Pinto and Osman could tell that his eyes were full of tears. He poured the entire glass of vodka down his throat and slammed it down on the tray at his feet as if it had contained bitter potion for his sorrow. But then, one day, Isaac Abramovich went on, a carp spoke in Hebrew from a fishmonger's stall. Everyone around the stall heard it, including my mother, who happened to be there, saying that a great evil would soon be coming upon us. The carp just opened its mouth and said it twice, and everyone heard it. And then only a few days later, a terrible pogrom took place. The pogromchiks went from Jewish house to Jewish house, killing and stealing. We climbed on the roof of our house, and they tried to reach us with hooks on long sticks to bring us down and slaughter us, but they couldn't because we were hugging the chimney. Finally, they gave up and moved, but they killed our dog just because they were in the mood for murder. What happened to Benya? Osman asked. The pogromchiks killed him. The police stood by and watched as they killed Benya. He was 28. They caught him on the street, beat him on the head with sticks and mallets, threw him into a ditch. What is it that makes people do things like that? Pinto asked, not expecting an answer. Nothing hurts more than losing a friend, Osman said. Isaac Abramovich refilled their glasses and said, the fat carp told us it was coming, but who was going to believe a stupid fish? And the funny thing was, once the carp stopped talking, they sold it. To my mother, of all people, who made a soup out of it. It was very good, the carp soup. Isaac Abramovich chuckled and raised his glass to indicate that the story was over. "To good friends," he announced. They downed the drink, then grunted to express the burn the vodka made. "Heals the soul," Osman said. "The world is full of souls that need healing," Isaac Abramovich said, and poured them another round. By this time, they sipped their vodka in silence, looking up at the sky in order not to talk. So if you haven't read the book, and I assume you haven't, you may recognize the outline of this book from Sarajevo to Shanghai by way of Galicia, Central Asia, and then between Central Asia and Shanghai. There's Xinjiang, Western China, or Western Chinese Republic, where the Uyghurs live or try to live, and the Taklamakan Desert. I'll read a little bit later from a Shanghai chapter. But what interested me in this book, it was not just this drive to return home, which seems very unlikely at any given time, but also the issue of migration and narration, and something that is known in linguistics as macaronic language. You may have noticed in the first chapter that I read that Pinto is already multilingual. His native language is Ladino, Spanish, as it was called in Sarajevo. His public language is Bosnian because he works downtown in the Charshia. And he also is a Viennese student who he speaks German. And then he starts moving east, which in the theory that I developed writing this book, not as a scholar, but as a storyteller, I realized that certain things happen when people migrate. One of them is that the need for narrative becomes greater. One could argue that the oldest narrative form in human history is the epic form. All of the early works of literature, from Gilgamesh to the Odyssey and On the Road by Jack Kerouac, there's a straight line through. That's not the only form, obviously. When people leave their home space and go somewhere else, and on that journey, they encounter challenges, they encounter new creatures, they encounter need for new words, and they accumulate knowledge about the world outside of the already known domain. The vessel for that knowledge is the narrative. And so all of those early epics and later epics have the basic structure where people go somewhere, like Odysseus, and that necessitates a story about their getting there and coming back. And so my idea was that once they start moving, Pinto and Osman, from Sarajevo to Shanghai, that the form would be very basic epic form, where the episodic in the same. So the plot of an epic poem or an epic novel is the journey, right? That's There could be some plot variations, but that's the basic plot. People go from point A to point B. I have come to believe that there's a biological need for narrative, in that before literacy, if you went over there and acquired some useful knowledge for your original home community, you would come back, and how would you transfer that knowledge to that community? That you saw a buffalo or salt or some town to rob and pillage. You would have to narratize the experience and bring it back, right? And of course, there's this whole, how would I put it, cultural, metaphysical, religious need to construct a view of the world that then sustains and confirms and affirms the home community, right? With the whole plot, or the structure of the Odyssey is that Odysseus goes out there, sees all kinds of strange creatures, comes back home, kills the Penelope's potential boyfriends, and restores the order. The Ithaca is well set as it is, and everything's back in place. I wanted to write a refugee epic where they leave home and never go back. So the order is never restored. So they have to keep moving. But they also remember Sarajevo as this home space until it becomes a little mythological. In fact, the original idea for the book, because I sold it on proposal, 3-page proposal to my British publisher for some reason, it had the exactly same trajectory from Sarajevo to Shanghai, but these two guys were friends. And the idea of that proposal was that as the farther away they move from Sarajevo, the more nostalgic they become to it and construct these narratives that kind of evolve from just remembering family and friends to a kind of mythological space, because obviously in those times they had no way to confirm that the city even existed, let alone get the news from anyone. This was, as you might remember, there was a time before the internet where in fact narrative was the main vessel of any kind of information and knowledge. So I wanted them to move east and never come back, but I realized, and I can't remember the moment or reason why I realized that nostalgia has a steady pitch. You can increase the volume, but the pitch is pretty much the same, right? It's nostalgia is retroactive utopia. So I decided that they should become lovers, and they did pretty early in the book. And that changed the disposition of the book, and also changed the focus of the book. It was no longer nostalgia, but love. I'm talking about this because in all these classic heroic epic poems, the main characters, the heroes, they have heroic abilities to kill the Cyclops or to go to the underworld and come out alive or whatever else. Whereas their only ability, or Pinto's special ability, he's not particularly heroic except that he's capable of loving in the most difficult circumstances. Because in the book, between 1914 and 1949, Shanghai, as this is their temporal trajectory, as they move through it, at no point do they stop and spend time in anything that we could recognize as a functional society, and then related infrastructures, which also allow people to have identities, civic and legal identities and so on. In other words, they're going to kind of, not quite a mythological space, but through a world of chaos. And throughout that world, the only power that Pinto and Osman have is love. I wanted to test the limits of love in the most difficult circumstances. So when they go to what is now Western China, they run into this insane warlord, an Estonian, German-speaking Russian, a white Russian who also believed he was a reincarnation of the Buddha, and promised his troops that he would have an alley of gallows from Mongolia to Moscow, where there would be commissars and Jews hanging all the way down. They survived that. But to go back to the epic structure, the other thing that interested me, as I was mentioning earlier, the Pinto's multilinguality, what I came to appreciate and thought about a lot is the idea of language that could be described, the term is macaronic language, from the word macaroni, because in the 17th century, some Italian writer, whose name I can't remember now, wrote a book in which he deliberately and satirically mixed Latin and Italian in the same sentence. And macaronic language describes, and forgive me if I'm saying something that everyone in the room knows, macaronic language describes any kind of discourse where two or more languages are used in the same discourse, right? It's common among immigrants. Parents speak homeland, our old land language, children speak the new land language, and somewhere when they talk at dinner table, they combine it because you can't remember the old word for an English thing that is here, right? And the kids do not know the parents' word for the thing, and so on. And so it happens, it's necessitated by displacement by and large. It is also, which is the same thing that's said differently in multicultural, multilingual communities, like cities, like Sarajevo, like Detroit. People combine languages, right? And in fact, it's a great nationalist fantasy that there was some time in the past when language was pure and uncontaminated by foreigners and their weird speaking patterns and words and whatnot. Of course, it's total, barring geographical isolation, that's total bullshit. Because people migrate, have always migrated. There were no borders or passports enforced really until the nation state was formed in Europe and then all over the world. People, so that all languages, is what I've come to believe, at some point were macaronic. English was Anglo-Saxon, and then the Normans came, and now we have a cul-de-sac in London. You can name any number of languages, Italian, right? And my own native language, Bosnian, which has a solid Slavic foundation, but after 500 years as part of the Ottoman Empire, there are many Turkish words, plus Arabic and Persian words by way of Turkish. And then the Austrians came, so that all the simple technology, words for simple technology are still German, like zipper is Reißverschluss in Bosnian, and the screwdriver is Schraubzieher, and there are many other. Sometimes with my friends we play a game and figure out, remember all the German words in Bosnian. I just spent a year in Berlin. Turned out I already knew some German. And then, of course, there are all these other languages that you can detect, and I busied myself. One of the things that writing and reading books does, it sensitizes you to things that you just took for granted. I started tracking and noticing foreign words in all kinds of languages. So there's a lot of Italian Bosnian because of the trade with the coast, but also of the great success of espresso machines and the Sanremo festival in the 70s and smuggling jeans from Trieste into Yugoslavia, right? Suddenly there are all these Italian words. And now, of course, the dominance of English and the internet culture, the kids in Bosnia have different words for liking a person and liking a post. And the word for liking a post is like, right? Because that's how it comes, how it happens. So macaronic language, wherever there's a point of contact of different languages and humans of different backgrounds, something happens to language. Why I love Sarajevo for many reasons. One of them is the language. And I'm not just talking about Bosnia, Sarajevo specifically, but of course Bosnia, because it is one of those territories where empires meet and fight and, conquer and kill and all that, but people talk to each other. They trade, right? So as does Pinto. But it also happens that you move from point A to point B, right? So Pinto ends up in Western China. What language can he speak, right? The best bet is a combination of various languages because everyone has picked up some. And the fascinating thing to me is, I don't want to give up the details of the book, but at some point he takes care of a little girl who he treats as his daughter. He thinks of her as his daughter because he actually thinks that Osman is the father. And as they move from Central Asia to Shanghai, and she becomes a young woman in Shanghai. But as they move together, the language of their communication is a very macaronic language that contains all the words, or the words from all the languages that they picked up along the way. The girl was born a refugee. She has no homeland, a home. The language she learned from him and people who took care of her, which could have been Kyrgyz or Uzbek or Uyghur or Russian, or his mother is Russian, Jewish. Her mother, and then all the way to Shanghai, where English comes into play, and also Chinese and so on. At some point, they have a language that only two of them can speak, and I did not want to try to convey that because it was beside the point. Because macaronic languages to my mind, is the language of intimacy, right? Sometimes it can be standardized. Creole is a macaronic language, right? And all the standardized languages were macaronic, and now they are kept pure by patriots. But for two of them, the end result of this situation of constant migration, movement through space, through languages and cultures and everything, is they develop a language that only two of them can speak, which, of course, is the utmost intimacy, but also kind of utmost isolation, too, that no one outside of their relationship can fully understand. In that sense, things are complicated, but you can read the book. Pinto also, he has, as you may have guessed from the first chapter, he likes opiates. So in Shanghai, he has graduated to opium from laudanum. And in this is in Shanghai, 1937. He's smoking opium with his lover, although they don't really do anything other than smoke opium, a Chinese man named Lu. Pinto did not know how long they had been in the smoking room or how many pipes he had smoked, 1 or 10. But the meze layout was still untouched, and the tea was cold, then hot, then cold again. And the temperature in the room rose, then dipped, then rose again, and he sweated until he didn't, then sweated again. Now there was more thunder and the roaring of airplanes over their heads, which must have meant it was daytime again. Using Lou's ivory back scratcher, Pinto struggled to reach that exact cursed spot between his shoulders that itched whenever he smoked opium, and often when he didn't. He scratched his nose too. Attending to an itch was inescapably delectable. Sometimes he and Lou lay embraced, scratching very slowly each other's back, and it was better than fucking. Osman never cared about morphine or opium, but he loved having his back scratched, gently with the fingertips. En cada dado un marafet, in every finger a skill. Sometimes he would hum a song while his back was scratched, which would sound like he was purring. Lou was cooling himself with his fan, adorned with a cherry tree in pink bloom, which a Japanese lover of his had once upon a time given him. Pinto watched the delicate fluttering of the fan until his eyelids slowly slid down his eyeballs. Abruptly, he had another pipe in his hand, and it gurgled and sang, "Noches, noches, buena noches," the ball twittered. "Dando vueltas por la cama, como el pez en la mar, ay, como el pez en la mar." Back in Tashkent, he had taught Osman the song, translated the words from Spanish, and Osman sang it back to him, always hitting the wrong note at la cama. After a while, Pinto could no longer remember what the right note was, what Manucci's voice used to sound like. The only voice he now had for the song was Osman's, presently accompanied by the gurgling bowl. So Pinto sang, hitting the wrong note at la cama the first time, exactly like Osman. I should say that by this time, Osman only appears to Pinto as a vision. So they're no longer together. So this is kind of a vision. But the note was right the second time, and the third time it was just as it was supposed to be. Then he realized that he wasn't the one singing. There was another voice doing it right. It perplexed him that Lou not only knew the song and the Spanish words, but also knew to hit the right note. And then it became clear to him it was Osman's Janino voice singing. Salto la primera y dicho, gozemos la mocedad, gozemos la mocedad. And without opening his eyes, Pinto knew that Osman was sitting at the foot of his opium-smoking bed. This wasn't the first time he sat there. Some days or weeks ago, whenever it was that he and Lou had started smoking this time around, Pinto had sensed his presence, his weight on the bed, and then saw the concern in his frown, the kind of fear Pinto did not like and did not want to accept because he was doing just fine. Opium was good for him, made him feel settled, and not thousands of miles away from where his life was supposed to be unfolding, and it helped with all his pain too. He had said nothing to Osman, and Osman had stayed quiet, occasionally lightly touching his foot or knee. Once Pinto thought Osman leaned over him to kiss his cheek, but was too content to move or even open his eyes, and did not want to find out that what he felt touched his face was a fly or dust or death or not, and not Osman's mustache. But Osman was singing now at the foot of his bed, and it was beautiful. Salto la segunda y dicho, gozemos la noviedad, gozemos la noviedad. There he was, his ruddy Hanino cheek, with his neatly trimmed mustache, the incongruous fez tipped rakishly to the side, the shirt unbuttoned, exposing his hirsute chest, wiping his armpits with a handkerchief. Pinto now wanted to sit up to kiss that cheek, touch that chest, put his head on Osman's shoulder, smell that sweat, but he didn't want to alert Lou or interrupt the singing, so he watched Osman's throat rising and falling as he inhaled and exhaled to produce the melodic voice, and his Adam's apple was bobbing. Salto la más chiquitita y dicho, madre como la voy a dejar, madre mía como la voy a dejar. As he sang the last line, Osman nodded at Pinto as if to confirm that he was in fact still there alive. Pinto moved his head to the curve of the porcelain pillow to make space for Osman's cheek, but Osman remained where he was, even after he stopped singing. Instead, he put his crooked hand on Pinto's left ankle, and his palm was cold. When our love was strong, we could lie on the edge of a sword. Wherever we lie now, I still think of that sword. I miss the sword. I held your hand on the blade. What I'm going to do now is play the song that I was just reading about. It was recorded by the great Bosnian artist and my friend Damir Imamović, who sings within the genre of sevdah, which is traditional Bosnian music coming from the Islamic Muslim background. But of course, as is the case, there's great overlapping. Melodically, it's very similar to Sephardic songs, and this is a Sephardic song because the Sephardim, as they came from the Iberian Peninsula into the Ottoman Empire, they also carried Arabic influences, musical influences, back to Bosnia, or not back to Bosnia, where they met different kinds of Arabic and Eastern scale influences that came with the Ottoman Empire. So melodically and harmonically, Sephardic music and Bosnian traditional music are pretty much the same. The difference might be the language. Anyway, halfway through writing the book, I called my friend Damir Imamović and talked him into recording an album that would be the musical accompaniment of the book, a kind of soundtrack, where he would record some of the Sephardic songs, but also the Bosnian traditional songs, or sevdah songs rather, the old Bosnian songs, and whatever else he wanted. There is traditional songs that Pinto and Osman sing to each other in the book, but also songs about them. And the biggest hit from the album is called Osman. It's about the main character. And so we haven't done it here, but we might do it. He's coming to tour here in the spring next year, but we sometimes perform together, where I read from the book and he, with his band, perform the songs that pertain to the passage that I had read. Or sometimes at literary festivals, he brings his string instrument, a modified saz, and then he plays some of those songs while I read. He's not here, unfortunately, but I have his album here. So while Elizabeth and I are setting up to have a conversation, I'll play this song. And this is the song that I was just reading about.
Noches, noches, buenas noches, noches son de enamorar. Ay, noches son de enamorar. Thessalonica se todas tres en ay, todas tres en un andar.
Thank you again for your talk.
Thank you.
It was great. So we can kind of start by, you've mentioned there's several themes that inspired the story. You've talked about a few of them, but I was wondering if you could maybe start, you've talked about the trajectory of the travel of Osman and Pinto, but what was your inspiration for choosing these places? What motivated that?
Well, I mean,
What's the
as I was
significance?
saying, it's because I found the story that in Bailey's memoir about Bosnians in prisoner of war camps in Central Asia. And so, which means that I had to bring them to Central Asia, and I had written stories that set in Shanghai for some reason. And in a different lecture, I can tell you the reason. I have had this fascination with Shanghai, colonial Shanghai, right, between the so-called Opium Wars in 1949, and this book. There's an epilogue in Jerusalem in 2001, but the Pinto and Osman part of the story ends in Shanghai in 1949. And so I wanted to take them to Shanghai because I had fascination with the story, and there are 3 chapters in Shanghai here. And so it was it's not a scholarly methodology, but when I write something, whether it's a story or book, I want to put things that interest me at the time or have interested me forever into that thing. And then I find a form or a situation or a plot or a trajectory that could keep all those things in the book at the same time. So I wanted multilinguality, I wanted the epic form, I wanted a love story, I wanted Bosnians, obviously, I wanted Shanghai, I wanted the crazy baron, I wanted a British spy, and so it's like you have all these toys, now we have to come up with a narrative that with all those toys could play a role. And so I then constructed this structure. I don't start with the, and not that there's anything wrong with it, I don't start with theoretical interests. And then try to, give characters the positions that will represent those theoretical ideas, but rather start with the toys and the story and characters and look for a form, and sometimes it takes a long time, where I could put all those things into the same narrative space.
Interesting. And then I'm just kind of wondering, if I feel like when I was reading the book, I really felt like there were some things that I was like, oh, this is so Bosnian or so former Yugoslavia, like so situated in specific context. And maybe that's some of the wit of the characters, if you mentioned, or the humor that's used. But I was just wondering if, to what extent do you think the story is specific to Bosnia, former Yugoslavia, or the region, so to speak, or is there something that maybe some of these ideas are more universal? Maybe you could expand on these. I mean, migration and narration.
Well, I think what is universal is specificity, so the uniqueness of human experience, right? We all our lives are a multitude of details that are specific to us. The combination, the structure of the multitude is specific to us, but there could be a lot of overlapping. So everyone in this room is sharing this moment, not just tonight, but the eve of the elections. There's a vast shared experience that could be easily formulated. At the same time, there are all these things that we brought from home. I mean, from today, never mind our life histories and backgrounds and family histories and all that. And so I find humans fascinating in that way, that no one is unique in a sense that has experience that no one ever had any of experiences like that. It is the combination that is unique, right? Everyone had parents, everyone loved someone, everyone has the body and, bowels and sexual desire and all these things were biologically identical. The difference is inconsequential, the hair, skin color, or any of that. but we exist in the world in an infinite number of different ways, right, in the same world. So we recognize the world as the same, by and large. I mean, the physics apply, unless, and I don't want to get into exceptions. But we also approach it in different ways. And so I think that the job of literature, at least the literature that I want to write, I have written, is to respect this specificity of human experience. So there's no one like Pinto and Osman, right? At the same time, they're like everyone else, because there's no one like them, because their lives, their family, their stories, their memories, their senses, their particular experiences, and so on. I also think that, as I was mentioning earlier, there's something fundamentally human about migration. There has never been a time when humans did not migrate. In fact, without migration, I can't even imagine what the world looked like. I mean, I'm not talking about the recent 20th century, 19th century. I'm talking about 25,000 years ago, someone walked from Africa to Europe, right? And kicked out the Neanderthals or whatever. But there was this, and we still have Neanderthal genes in us, because even, you know, in those fights, they were, well, having sex, obviously, but also communicating in some way to have sex. And so moving through space is a human ability, right? This is why pelvis is narrow, which is why babies are born as altricial, that is helpless at birth, right? So that we could walk. As we can walk, we can migrate. If we migrate, we have to go over there and see what's there and have the ability to collect food or knowledge. And language becomes useful in that, because it becomes a medium of transmitting knowledge, and the narrative comes out of that language, because organizing that knowledge, narratizing it, is a way to transmit it. And out of all that comes human civilization. Out of our ability to migrate, biological ability. And to me, and I don't want to get into arguments with imaginary real enemies who are anti-immigrant, right? To me, that's a fundamental thing. That is as universal as can be. And I wanted to, and everyone in my family, on a personal note, no one in my family dies in the country where they were born, for generations now, without sometimes leaving the town where they were born. And so to me, those are my people, right? Migrants, immigrants, refugees, they're my people. And so I want to write a book about my people, and not just Bosnians, but people who moved through space, raised children while foraging for food in the desert. Those are the people I want to write about. It's no Philip Roth.
Yeah. I mean, it was really interesting, because I was thinking to ask you, you know, like, kind of, you've answered it, but like thinking when I was reading it, like all of these like themes are so salient today, right? And we think about like war and conflict, human displacement, unprecedented levels of migration, but by taking it back to history, we see that it is, like, it's not necessarily novel, right? So
I think, I mean, it's kind of obvious to us, but I find it fascinating still, after all these years of writing books like this, that we can read books written 5,000, 3,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago. Gilgamesh is 3,000 BC or so, right? And we have a sense of strangeness, because people don't live like that anymore. At the same time, you think, oh, Gilgamesh, I know that guy. Someone who doesn't want to die, he becomes best friend with, you know, with Enkidu, and then go to the underworld. And the ability to transmit knowledge over thousands of years, while being incredibly stupid in the present, is entirely fascinating. And also across the world. I mean, it's a huge thing to conceptualize humanity and the earth as an entity to which we are all, in some ways, equally related. It wasn't always like that, right? And this is, if we have many civilizational failures, obviously, but one of the great ones is we have conceptualized humanity and connection of humanity with one place. And that was possible, well, because of migration, but also because of literature and art, and the striving toward understanding someone who's unlike us.
Yeah. You mentioned kind of this like will to live, right? And like that phrase that comes up in your book throughout it, like everything that lives wants to keep on living. And one of the other themes that you maybe could talk a little bit more about, but thinking about this perseverance and willingness to survive. I mean, you've mentioned language, and I guess also the ability to love, right, which we saw with Pinto, but what else like helps with that? Like what is?
Well, I mean, maybe this is the same thing said differently. I think that because we are migrating creatures, and it's biological, that people, when they migrate, they move toward a space where they believe they will have greater agency as human beings, right? So, which means in very specific terms, go where the kids can go to school, where you can find a job to feed them, or, agency exists only when you're alive. So you want to go somewhere where someone will not kill you. And so this perseverance is not a refugee or someone who's displaced. I mean, there are all kinds of situations and cases and people. But you always think one step ahead, not more, right? You get to the next safe place. And then you make it to the next safe place, and you go to the next safe place. And if you make it all the way to whatever, Germany or Ann Arbor, then you're good. But that might take years, and you might never make it. So the perseverance is, I think, related to, and I don't mean this in a Buddhist philosophical New Agey term, is living in the moment, right? That is, you cannot carry your history on your back. People used to carry pictures, and I cannot tell you how many Bosnian refugees told me a story where someone ran into the burning house, not to save the money, not to save the TV, not to save anything of value other than pictures. Because if you don't have your own story with you, it will not be remembered otherwise. And this is where the narrative comes in too. So people moving to space, refugees, they come from somewhere, and that somewhere is in the stories about that place. And if they make it to the other side, they can reconstruct some kind of cultural practices, collect the pictures, have an exhibit of Vishivankas, whatever. But in that transition, it's all this now, and the history in the narrative, and the kind of the horizon of possibilities that is hard to imagine, let alone see. But even that is narratized. There's this place over there, and this is where we're going, right? And I think that is, perseverance is not something you get at the beginning of the journey, right? If you survive the journey, then it's perseverance. If you don't, then no one remembers you. And so the stories that remain are the stories of perseverance and survival and miracles and so on. With all that, I think our another great human ability is to love. And I don't mean just love for the purpose of biological reproduction, although obviously that's necessary, but to have this whole discourse of love, to convey love or deposit it in songs, in art, and to practice love not just as physical, though physical is essential to it, the physical to it, but also to look for language for it. I mean, it's just an enormous amount of human texts that are about love in the history of humanity. However, love was construed at the time of the writing, right? So, Odysseus kills the potential boyfriends. That's love, right? It's kind of ungainly for today's standards, but it's love too. But love has always, in all of the texts, in works of art, it's always the discourse of love. And so, as I was saying, I wanted my characters to be heroic, but their heroic ability is love and nothing else.
Interesting. Then another theme that I thought maybe you'd want to tell us a little bit about or talk more about would be kind of thinking about also throughout it, like this is how the world is supposed to be, this is how it's meant to be. I mean, you've talked here a little bit about Osman's religious, being Muslim, and the Pinto being Jewish, but I'm just wondering, you also refer to the higher one, right? What is this role of kind of, there's like maybe it's two parts questions, and you can tell me if they're related or not, but with like religiosity, but also with this kind of understanding of fatalism that's kind of...
Well, Pinto is, coming from a traditional family, but he's also a Viennese student. The Bosnia, as part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, still practiced a lot of, it's still very much in the 19th century as compared to Vienna, let alone other Western European cities. So Pinto finds himself at the beginning of the book at the cusp between two centuries, but also looking back and looking forward, like Walter Benjamin's Angel of History. So it was logical to me that he would be agnostic, right? That he would not be a believer, and not only because he, there's a Yetzer Hara, the notion of sin in Judaism, that is, would have described his homosexuality, but also because he went to Vienna. The century of progress is ahead of us, he thought, on June 28th in the morning, 1914. So I wanted him to be agnostic, and so as an agnostic, he goes through this, from Sarajevo to Shanghai, through this cycles of war, when incredibly horrible things happen, where there's very little to, be impressed by in terms of work of God, other than just incredible cruelty. So he enters this argument with God, and he's of course well versed in the Torah, and went to yeshiva, and his father was very religious, and then that sort of ties in with his continuous argument with his father, who was as punitive as God in the Old Testament or the Torah. And so as he passes through all that, he has these imaginary arguments with imaginary beings. The characters of Osman and Pinto are different in that Osman is reflective. He spends a lot of time inside his head, talking to himself and arguing with people in various languages, whereas Osman is extrovert, skillful, a skill in every finger, charming, and so on. And I in the Lazarus Project, my other novel, there's a similar distribution of psychological distribution, for the lack of a better word, between two characters. But I wanted the central consciousness in the book is Pinto's consciousness. So all of these battles are playing out in his head, and so including his argument with the Holy One. I'm not religious at all, so I have to put myself, I'm not even agnostic. I've had to put myself in Pinto's head, where I spent a lot of time.
Interesting. I want to ask one more question, and then we can kind of turn it to the audience as well, because I want to give them time to ask a question. But one thing that I was kind of wondering about this, and you had mentioned that you visit Sarajevo often, that your book has been translated and it's released, right, in Sarajevo. And I'm wondering, I guess because I was thinking about like the times that I have been to Sarajevo, like the memory of recent war and conflict is something that's on everyone's mind. People want to talk about, tell stories from, retell stories, and then thinking of people who have migrated, knowing people here in the U.S. who have left, who have come from Bosnia or even other places in former Yugoslavia. And I'm just wondering if you could kind of talk, because this is not about the recent conflict, recent war, but like how is the book being received there, and what's your experience there? Maybe you could tell them about how you've performed. Yeah.
I mean, I go there often and do work there in various ways. And for many years I was writing a column in Bosnia. They were coming out 15 years or so. And they were published as books. So people know my work as a columnist and journalist, but also as a fiction writer. And they're under the impression that I'm very successful here. I'm not unsuccessful, but it's exaggerated vastly in Bosnian media, my success, which I did not try to talk them out of, but don't tell anybody. And so people know about my work. It is translated, it is well received, it is well published, and I go there a lot and work with people. So for this book, which was published earlier this year, it was great. I enjoyed it. And as I was mentioning, Damir and I, the musician and I, we performed together. So we had a performance in Sarajevo, which was great, and the book was well received. It's not a direct answer to your question, but I was mentioning it to you earlier in your office, that for a long time now, I don't go to Sarajevo for nostalgic reasons. I don't go see the landscapes of my youth and see the old friends and get the news. I know the news. You get them on Instagram daily. And also, you can eat cevapi so many times in your life, and then it's not that impressive. But I discovered some years ago that the best way to maintain that connection and to further develop it is to work with people there. And I got involved in all kinds of collaboration, including music. I'm very involved in the translations of my book. I edit them closely. I work with my publisher. I helped them organize a festival, a literary festival there, and many other things. And what that, among other things, allowed me to do is to meet younger people. Because not everyone talks about the war. Right? The war ended almost 30 years ago. There's a whole generation, they're sick of their parents talking about the war. Yeah, you were under siege, we know. That's fine, we're sorry, but what am I going to do now? 25, no work, right? Where am I now? And also have different ideas about art, about music, about film and all this. And so one of the things that so Damir was 14, the musician, when the war started, right? He remembers it, and it's still present in his mind, but he actualized a human being after the war. His life was not ruined by the war, right? It was slowed down, as it were, and his high school years were not as, he did not worry about things that high schoolers in countries where there's no war think about. But he became an artist and everything else after the war. And there's a whole generation. And there are more generations coming, obviously. And those are, I love my old friends and artists and everyone, and we drink and coffee and other things and gossip. But I'm, in some ways, at least as an artist, more interested in the younger ones. What I want to see what they're up to, what they're doing. And that's anything from film to music to visual arts. And they're everywhere, and they're much better than me and my generation in many ways. They're less damaged, at least. And they're the hope. Just like here, right? We screwed it up for the kids, but they're probably smart enough to, get out of trouble at least a little bit.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank
so
you.
I'll just remind you that we have microphones here and here. If you could stand, you can line up to ask your question. Just say your name and maybe your affiliation before you ask the questions. You just go to them. I think Gosha and Geta, are you going to, someone doing? Geta, is that one on?
Thank you so much for
Elena,
sharing
sorry.
your stories and the sounds as well. My name is Lilith. I'm a second-year student at CREES with the department. And I have two questions. Yeah. So I have two questions. I will start from the first one that is easier to formulate and I think to answer probably as well. So it's about music. Last semester I was working on a project that was on music that is in the diaspora, Armenian diaspora, basically, that migrated from, I come from Armenia, so I was working with music here that migrated, was displaced from the Ottoman Empire and still keeps the music that is called Keftime music. You might have heard of it. It's not only Armenian, but also the Greeks and the Jewish people also play this and sing, but at the same time it has become very politicized, this music, because it is from the past that is highly controversial, is painful, and so there is this battle now of people wanting to own it because it's the songs and the music and the sounds of their past, and at the same time, again, this is politicized, the history is difficult. So I was wondering if in the music that you played, these worlds in a way also collide, and I was wondering what this means to the Bosnian people now in Bosnia and elsewhere in the diaspora. Is it controversial, not controversial at all, if there is anything?
That's a very interesting question. Well, the general thing with diaspora is that there's an epidemic of nostalgia in diaspora. And of course, as you might know here, the great Svetlana Bourne book, The Future of Nostalgia, right, where she makes a difference between reflective and restorative nostalgia. Reflective nostalgia is personal, individual, remembering the songs from your youth, the summer smells in your town, the first love, whatever, sensory details that have no place in some kind of larger narrative, right? And restorative nostalgia is the nationalist nostalgia, make America great again. There's this fictitious time where things were great and they want to bring it back, right? And so music and art can play both ways, obviously. Like it applies, so you can listen to music from your homeland, and whenever it was produced, and it activates these memories, sort of this the presence of the past in your life, and the painful, which will reflect on nostalgia, is always aware of the fact that it cannot be restored, that it's gone. You can only remember it, and you remember it with certain, the nature or the essence of Sevdah music, and I assume Armenian music, that kind of music, where people who have been displaced and have lost historically stuff, is a strange pleasure in the pain, right? So if the song is sad about a sad love story, but you are singing it and you're sharing with other people, and there's some kind of communion in not enjoying the pain, but with being in touch with the pain, or as they say these days, they owning the pain, right? Whereas restorative nostalgia wants and nationalists, they want to use art and culture as the things that contain the essence of the people, which is under attack by someone else, here or elsewhere, and therefore it must be pure. It cannot be contaminated. It has to be practiced and approached with absolute reverence. It's very often very close to religious practices, right? First the prayer, then the singing and the dancing, right? And so that quickly becomes boring for obvious reasons. As far as Damir, and this is what I was mentioning, younger generation, he has a great privilege. He comes from a dynasty of Sevdah singers. His grandfather is the seminal singer of Sevdah, recorded an enormous amount of songs. He was like a fully employed national radio and television singer, where someone would bring these songs and they would record them over and over, not over and over again. The whole trove of those songs is because there was a state radio television station that recorded this. Anyway, his grandfather was a star. His father was also a singer. So that he knows it so well and writes books about it, but he also has total freedom, and he's not impressed by sort of nationalist nostalgia at all. He doesn't care. And for this album, for my book, I mean, I didn't produce it, obviously, but we talked. He would send me demos. I would send him chapters. He deliberately changed. He kind of, in the eyes of nationalists, he violated some songs fundamentally. Not to mention that in the eyes of nationalists generally, sort of nationalists and fascists are always homophobes, right? Because nation has to be reproduced, for which you have to, the nation owns women's wombs, and and sort of sexual pleasure is suspect, particularly if religion is involved. And so Damir is an openly gay man, and the songs, and this is a book about love between two men, and the songs as they are sang foreground the possibility, because, and I'm sure it's something you know, in the history of queer people, when they could not be openly present in society, their love and feelings were encoded in songs and practices. So a lot of Sevdah songs, in fact, and Damir has done a great work as a musicologist, not just as a musician, uncovering those traditions. And so those songs are present on his album. So, and it hasn't been controversial, because as of now, the Bosnian diaspora is not as fascist as some other diasporas. Maybe later, but right now they're not that fanatical.
Thank you so much. I
Thank
will
you.
keep my question for when we have time later, or for tomorrow.
So I have a question. This makes good sense. We all migrate, and both you and I and everybody, maybe in this room has come from different places and so on. And the need to narrate your experience is very human. And, I read Lady Murasaki, who wrote it, 3,000 years ago and stuff like that. But what is also, to me, puzzling is why this doesn't then improve the relationships between groups, and why the groups then feel territorial and fight migration. I mean, just look at what's happening in this country. This is the main political issue, migration. And then, there's this conflict between migration and territoriality, claiming a territory. And I, for instance, in former Yugoslavia, Tito opened the borders and tried to control Serbs, who were the most, aggressive and big and prosperous group, by opening the borders in the south and letting a lot of Albanians essentially populate an area that was claimed by Serbs as their national heritage. So a lot of reason for this series of talks is, my mother's kind of anxiety about it. Why do people hate? You keep talking about love as one of the things that binds people and, enriches their life. But there's an awful lot of hate, too. I mean, this country is right now split in two that hate each other's guts. And so anyway, if, from your perspective and your interests, could you kind of give us some
Well, groups cannot have relationships except territorial or kind of formal relationships. Groups can't love each other because there are too many people, unless there are 2 or 3 people, right? So there's a love is always practiced at the level of the body, individually, right? Or usually individually. So for groups to have any kind of relationship, first the groups have to be formalized conceptually, so to speak, to find some kind of bonding principle that is not contingent upon the people who are individually part of the group, right? So the whole concept of the nation, it doesn't matter who's alive, who's not, right? Americans will always exist, Serbs will always exist, even if people die. So it is a much bigger question, the kind of political philosophy that gives human agency to nations, right? As though nations have feelings and psychologies and essences and all this, and so that once you are born into that nation, all of that is automatically downloaded into you, right? And you cannot change, and if you change, you're a traitor, or you can't live there, you do not belong. And so that is, that's the basis of nation state, because the claim for nation state that is, well, here are these people who are connected in this particular way, and they're entirely distinct from those other people, including the language. We cannot understand them because we have a different psychology, they have a different psychology, we have different language, the languages cannot be combined in any way. So we cannot really live together, we need our nation state. So we have to draw a border around the territory, and this is where we live. And those on the other side, they're not part of this nation. And if they live here, well, they can live, they might or might not be welcome, but they're not on their land. And so it requires ethnic cleansing or genocide, which is how they fix such things in Europe, including in Yugoslavia, to sort this whole thing out. But that all is kind of it's a logical spiral that if you start thinking about nations as these sovereign entities that have essences and psychological profile and all this, then you end up in sort of groups like 2 people having a relationship. So groups don't hate each other, right? Unless someone makes them hate. So this is what we're watching here. It's not, this country is divided not because something unknown happened. It's because of Fox News. Like before 1933 in Germany, well, there was anti-Semitism. Of course there was. It was all over Europe, right? But 1935, it's an entirely different game. It's much more than just anti-Semitism. There are legal principles. I mean, there are laws that ban people from public spaces and reward people who inform on them, right? There's a social legal incentive to hate others, right? And so it's not unknown why Trumpists hate people like me, right? Because the privilege that they think they're entitled to by virtue of being born as Americans is somehow endangered by me, who I look like, I could pass as a Trumpist given my head shape and whatnot. But people of color cannot, right? And so they are the ones, or trans people, they identified as enemies, those who are taking away the privilege. And this narrative was perpetuated in a number of ways, everyone knows all this. It is everywhere, but it's not because the groups hate each other. Let me tell you a story. My grandmother, not really my grandmother, but my parents, when they moved to Sarajevo, they rented a room with her and her husband. I was born there. They spoiled me for life, my mother says. And when I was going back to Sarajevo, I would always stay with her, even when we had our apartment back, and I loved her. And she grew up she was Catholic. She grew up in a small town in Bosnia. and was a young woman at the time, World War II. And so her father had a store next to the market. And when World War II started, the groups started killing each other. He was Catholic, and I can't remember, I think it was the Chetniks who took him to the river to slit his throat, or it could have been the Ustashi too, the Croat. Anyway, someone was taking him to the river to slit his throat, not just him, but a whole bunch of people with their hands tied in the back in January. And so he survived because he jumped in the river with his hand tied in January before his throat was slit, and they shot at him, but he survived. Cut to after the war, right? He's back in his store. My grandmother is carrying food to him for lunch at lunchtime. And he's drinking coffee with a guy next to him, right? And in Bosnia, drinking coffee, it's like, it's the most intimate thing, right? And when I was young, let's have a coffee, man. Let's have sex, right? So, let's have coffee. And so we'll meet up and have sex, right? Because it's intimacy. Anyway, he wasn't having sex with this guy, but it's intimate, like you do it with close people. And so she brings him food, and her father says, do you know who this guy is? And she says, I know. He was the one who was going to slit his throat. And when she told me the story, I said, what, it's crazy. So what did this guy say? And she said, nothing. He just kind of just shrugged. And what I derived from that story is this. They were good neighbors and friends before the war, or before the regime change. And then the regime came and gave incentives in various ways to slit your neighbors' throats. And then the regime was gone, and then they were drinking coffee together, right? It was not groups hating each other. And the ethics of it, or this is how I think about it. You have, among humanity, you have psychopaths who are evil in any given set of circumstances, right? Trump and such. It doesn't matter what the regime is, how loved, unloved they are, none of it matters. It's, it's a sickness of a sort. And they have saints who forgive everything to everyone, right? And those are small groups. Everyone in between is a good person until they're not. And then when that set of circumstances that allow them to be evil in some way is over, they might be good people again. Of course, what's done cannot be undone. But that means that the value of democracy and all of these things that I assume many of people in this room believe in, including me, respect for other people and their life histories and their identity and all those things, that a system that's always imperfect, that works toward that end, right? Blocks the hatred of groups against each other. And this is, I'm going to tell you how to vote, but obviously. But also this is what I've been, dealing with my entire life in Yugoslavia or here or whatever. And this is the world as it is, right? And so I don't have the power to convert that, to establish a regime where that would be very well rewarded. But as a society, if we're not working toward that, then you might as well get a job at Fox News. And obviously, art has neutral value. The Nazis had art, of course. Invested a lot in art, right? But art as a practice allows for creating conditions to understand and appreciate and love, as I do, the vast variety of human beings. The incredible biological, intellectual, cultural, any number of criteria, variety of humans. And that's the most beautiful thing. Right? To this day, I've seen the world, and I'm old, and I'm cynical. I walk down the street, and I think, oh, look at this person. What is this person thinking? And look at the students. I was walking around lunchtime. I teach at Princeton. It's a small place. There were more students in the quad than the entire city of Princeton today. And they're all beautiful. They're young with their backpacks. They go. They had ideas. They have plans. They're determined. And I was touched. And I get touched every time, every week at Princeton, because I love that humanity, that variety of humanity. Right? My uncle, and I'll end here. I talk a lot. my mother's brother, who I love, he said, I'll say it in Bosnian first, and then I'll try to translate it. Kakvih nas ima, takvih nas treba. Whatever kind of us there is, those are the kinds that we need as humans. That's the beauty of humanity. So groups tend to be wrong, if you wish, in that respect.
We have one more.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Maybe my question can be more about individuals and less so about group, although it'll be a little bit about group. My name is Dejan Doric. I'm originally from Sarajevo, so I'm like one of the last people that has still Sifiraya on their birth certificate. I was born in 91, so you know your friend Damir, maybe I'm like one generation down. I'm a linguistic anthropologist, and I study actually youth culture, language in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And my question is about that, because like the way you talk about youth is inspirational, but also aspirational to a certain extent. And I think you used the phrase like staying out of trouble. And thinking about migration, one way to stay out of trouble, unfortunately, for a lot of Bosnian youth is to move away from Bosnia, right? You're going to stay out of trouble maybe in Germany and not in Sarajevo. But thinking about that, can you maybe reflect a little bit also on like the nostalgic aspects? Because I know for a certain generation that still plays a role, even though they haven't lived through the Yugoslav period, there's something, you know, alluring about it. Their parents tell their stories about the stability maybe, etc. But general, like how do you experience youth culture in Sarajevo?
Well, I mean, youth culture is good everywhere because, I mean, my students are all undergrads in their 20s, and I feed off their energy and curiosity, but also I can see how fragile they are and how difficult for them is to process certain things. It was probably difficult for me too at that age, but I don't remember. Or I was busy with partying too, so there's some blank spots. I think that and I hate though, I still do not know who Generation X or Z or whatever is. That to me doesn't make any sense. I cannot sort it out at all. I don't know what generation I am or what generation you are. It makes no sense because somehow it's like horoscope, right? Somehow you have these magical common characteristics because you were born in 99 and not in 2001. It just, to me, doesn't make sense. But what the younger people have is the awareness, I think, that in my experience is not so present in my generation across the world, is that it's not good. It is not good, right? That we screwed up, right? And that they have to deal with it in various ways. And they're not blaming us too much right now, but that'll come as it should. When I was growing up, my parents loved Yugoslavia because both of them were born in houses with dirt floors, and pretty much, they don't allow me to say they were poor because they had food, right? But that's all they had was food. There's nothing else. There were one pair of shoes for 10 of them in my father's family. So they had to piss in the snow in shifts, like one line up in the house to take the same shoes to go and piss in the snow. But they, they had college degrees. They came and became, in Yugoslavia in 91, they were middle class, right? College educated, first ones in their respective families, and so on. Whereas my sister and I were just like, don't bore me with Yugoslavia and socialism. It's just so boring. And so we were rebellious. I was rebellious, right? And so only after the fact, when I wrote a book about my parents, where finally I listened to them. And so they told me interesting things. What I appreciated in their connection to Yugoslavia, and what I envy them, and I think that younger generations might too, is that they had a sense, however sloppily constructed Yugoslavia was, however much it depended on Tito's leadership, so when he died it all collapsed. There was this thing that none of those nation states have and will never have, and certainly not Bosnia, which is not even practically a nation state, is they had a sense of participating in a common civic project. They had the horizon toward everyone was moving. Right? Both of my parents worked for a state company called Energoinvest in Bosnia, right? And Jasmila Žbanić, the Bosnian film director, just came out with a documentary film on Emmerich Bloom, was the director of Energoinvest, the socialist capitalists. It's fascinating. one of the things that's fascinating, that he thought that developing this big company will help everyone, right? And this is all working toward the betterment of the entire society. The idea of the betterment of an entire society is absolutely alien to so-called countries in transition. His commitment to capitalism eliminates that, for one thing, but also the fact that, I don't know, political consciousness is not that present. But there are people like you. I spent a year in Berlin, and in Berlin, the younger people, 35 and under, from former Yugoslavia, they have organizations, art organizations, they have discussions, they have PhDs, they see through all of that. I doubt that the generations of their parents who are in power in Bosnia and elsewhere will let them get anywhere close to the political system, right? But they are the gold in the Swiss bank. You know, one day, the wars in Yugoslavia were financed and supported and conceptualized to a large extent by fascist diaspora, those who ended up all over the world, a lot of them in North America and Australia, who escaped Tito and partisans and all that. And they were waiting for 40 years, fantasizing about, well, let's make Croatia, Serbia, or Slovenia, or Kosovo great again. Whereas these kids are now the immigration, right? And to me, they are the hope. They can think of those things in a different way. And that knowledge is finding way into those spaces. It's very difficult for any number of reasons, but to the extent it exists in that space, it is very much connected with diaspora.
I think we have time for one final question. Yeah,
Hi, I'm Sonia Srinivasan. I'm a writer and a musician, and I enjoyed your piece, your critique of Philip Roth. And I wanted to ask about some of your opinions about American fiction, which can be criticized as being rather insular, rather personal, whereas writers from many other parts of the world, their language is macaronic. There's a lot more history, layers of different elements, so to speak. And it's not just fiction, but it's also history, it's culture, it's music, etc. I was curious about your comments.
Well, it's a very complex question. I mean, it could be useful to make a distinction between American literature and American publishing. American literature is produced by writers, right? And they have uneven access to publishing, right? And you can read about, I don't know, representation in American publishing. To what extent is, various groups that constitute this Americans, and including immigrants, to what extent they're represented in American publishing, right? And it's the publishing that is insular. People write all over the place. And publishing determines the way the books are read in many ways, and what is read and what is valued, what gets the prizes, what is published with budget behind it, what is just dropped into the 10,000 books, literary publications that come out in this country every year. It's an enormous number. And what is supported and presented as this is the great American novel or whatever. Having said that, what American literature has is this accommodating American English language, right? Because, and which is even more macaronic than standard English, I think. I like to quote William Carlos Williams, the great American poet, arguably the greatest American poet of the 20th century, who spoke Spanish at home because his father was Puerto Rican, I think. And he was given an interview about Patterson, his great long poem about New Jersey. And the interviewer asked him where he got this particular phrase, the source of a particular line. And William said, from the mouths of our Polish mothers. And to me, that means that the poetry of William Carlos Williams was fed macaronically. And so, because American national identity cannot be located exclusively in language, right? Because they speak English all over the place, right? One of the claims of European nation states is there's no one like us, no one speaks this language. If we do not protect it, we will vanish as a people, so we have to protect ourselves, right? So you cannot base that argument on the language in the United States. So it's a little more open in that sense. So you can accommodate people like me, right? to be perfectly honest, this book was not a great success, but it was published, right? It exists as a fact now, right? Meanwhile, in France, for instance, right, they to this day make distinction between French writers and Francophone writers, that is, writers from North Africa or, French-speaking Sub-Saharan Africa or Quebec, right? And they, in criticism, in reviews, in everything, that distinction is still present as totally valid, which is obviously segregationist, obviously to me, segregationist. And American language and American literature is more accommodating in that respect, right? It is more open to macaronic, if you wish, influences, and that's what I value in it. So that people who come to American English, they can publish a story in the New Yorker. Now we can get into what is favored over what's not, whether assimilationist stories are, or novels are more valued by the publishing industry, right, than those, I don't know, for the lack of a better word, anti-assimilationist. But that's a different argument. But in terms of just the practice of literature, I think that's the value of American literature.
Interesting. Well, thank you once again, Aleksandar, for joining us
Thank
for
you.
this conversation and discussion and readings. And yeah, well, that will end our programming for the evening. But thank you so much.
Thank you, my pleasure.